Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Russ Carson, and it's my privilege to be introducing you today to our three speakers and to our panel. The subject is, does globalization have a future? And I can't think of three more qualified people to speak to that particular issue than the three that we have today. I'm going to talk just for a minute or two about Glenn Hubbard, who's a longtime friend of mine, and then Glenn will talk about our other two speakers. I had the privilege of serving as chairman of the board of overseers for Columbia Business School for 10 years, which encompassed both the last years of Mayor Feldberg's reign as dean and the early years of Glenn Hubbard's. In 1994, I endowed a chair at Columbia Business School, and Mayor Feldberg asked me who I'd like to pick to sit in that chair. He gave me three resumes at the time. I looked at the three, I thought about it pretty carefully, and I selected a young man named R. Glenn Hubbard as the person who should occupy the chair with my name on it. That was 24 years ago, and Glenn, I'm very happy that I'm still here and that you're still here. I think most of you know Glenn's history, and I'm not going to go through a lot of it. When I first met Glenn, he was coming off 2 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He later, as most of you know, spent 2 years from 2001 to 2003 as Chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. So Glenn is one of those unique people who has both academic experience as well as government experience. He also has spent a significant amount of time in the private sector by serving on a number of private sector boards, which I think was really the perfect background for his ultimate assignment in 2004 as Dean of Columbia Business School. During the past 14 years, the school has made enormous strides in all directions. Just a few of the things I'd highlight are we've dramatically expanded the number of endowed faculty chairs. We've greatly expanded the financial aid program so that we can take in people who may not be able to afford the high cost of tuition in today's world. I think probably most importantly, Glenn was the one who conceived of putting together a new business school building or business school campus, which most of you, I think, haven't had the chance to be up there and see where it's located and see what it's going to look like. But it is going to truly be spectacular. And it's going to transform Columbia Business School from probably having the least desirable facilities of the five major business schools to having state-of-the-art facilities. Glenn, I think that will be a significant part of your legacy when it opens in 2001. And then the last thing I'd give Glenn a lot of credit for is he's expanded our Board of Overseers fairly significantly during his tenure, which means we've gotten more and more alumni actively engaged in the school. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Glenn and let him introduce the other speakers. I'd just say again, it's been my privilege, Glenn, to have funded the chair that you've sat in all these years. I hope you sit in it for the next 30 years, and we're both here 30 years from now.
Thank you, Russ. Thank you. I truly wouldn't be here but for Russ Carson. I know I have the most expensive piece of furniture that you and Judy have ever bought, so I'm delighted at that. How many of you were at Carlos's lunch talk? Okay, so that's a perfect segue in a couple of ways. We're going to tackle globalization, which he mentioned. This is the academic effort 5% part here, the three of us. You just heard from the better remunerated 95% execution part. So we're going to round that out for you today. Our panelists don't really need much introduction. I'll give a short one. I have known Bruce Greenwald and Joe Stiglitz each for decades. Joe, of course, is a Nobel Laureate in economics. He is somebody I learned a lot in my academic discipline of public economics over many years. It has taken the policies of Donald Trump to bring Joe and me closer together in the political spectrum. And Bruce Greenwald is a treasured colleague and guru to the gurus of value investing. But what some of you may not know is Bruce and Joe together teach what's probably the most popular class in the entire MBA program on globalization, It's usually done in a block week format, so students will come in from all over the world to work with Bruce and Joe, and I think the conversation we're going to have this afternoon will give you a bit of the flavor of what happens in the classroom. Now, I don't really want to talk about Donald Trump, but I'm going to start by talking about Donald Trump. So let's start with Trump and trade, and China in particular. Are we approaching the trade question in the right way, Joe?
Well, obviously not. It's really hard to know where to begin, but maybe I should begin where sometimes the conversations begin with the trade deficit. And he says, we have this large trade deficit. It's actually gotten larger with China. And the implication of that is, since we're obviously better than anybody else, if we aren't selling them lots of goods, they must be cheating. So that's the proof that there has to be something unfair going on. Now, economics is very clear about maybe three propositions. First, that the only thing that really matters for macroeconomics is the multilateral trade deficit. In other words, it doesn't matter which particular country. If we stop buying apparel from China and we bought it from Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, it's not going to affect American workers in any significant degree. So it's the multilateral trade deficit that matters. Secondly, the multilateral trade deficit is basically determined by the disparity between domestic aggregate savings, what we as a country save, and domestic aggregate investment, what we invest. And those are macroeconomic factors. So trade agreements will affect which country we buy which goods from. There's a little bit effect on standards of living, efficiency, but overall, the savings and investment is what determines our trade deficit. So that means that when you have a change in macroeconomic policy, like an increase in the fiscal deficit, and the fiscal deficit increased enormously between December 2017 and January 2018 by almost 3% of GDP. That is going to translate almost surely, there are a couple of other things that could happen, into an increase in the trade deficit. So trade agreements are not what is going to drive what's going to be happening in trade. It's really the macroeconomic framework. And then finally, one of the other things that is very special about Trump's position is it's actually very Marxian. He wouldn't think of it that way, but he distinguishes between manufacturing goods and services. So he thinks all that really counts is manufacturing industry. And for instance, when he talks about the U.S. as a trade deficit with Canada, we actually have a trade surplus with Canada, but it's a surplus in services. And of course, those of us in the education sector think that what we're doing, which is a service, has some value. And and those of you in finance probably think that what you do is also important, and that's called a service. But he's not interested in the services. He keeps looking at the trade, the deficit in goods, and says Canada has been treating us unfairly because we have a deficit in goods. The interesting thing, maybe I'll just make one more remark, which is
One more.
Okay. The trade negotiators, Mexico and Canada, have a really hard time, had a really hard time because they were well educated and they understood everything I just said. And so they had a political problem. They said, how are we going to negotiate? We're supposed to be doing something that's good for the United States, and for Canada and for Mexico. How do we get an agreement? And one of the things that was very striking, they said, we understand this is not about the trade, the trade deficit in goods and services. This is about politics. That where the goods are problem is the Midwest and the South, and that's the political base. And where the services are being produced are New York, California, and that was something that was not particularly interested. And so when they were negotiating, they were very aware of the internal American politics that was going to have to be a piece of the solution.
Yeah, I want to turn back to those politics and workers
get
in just
to
a second.
respond to
I said that was a prelude. Now, just as a warning, these two don't always agree. With that in mind, Bruce.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to disagree with the most fundamental statement here about Trump bringing people together. It did bring Glenn and Joe closer together. Nothing brings anybody closer to me. So what I'm going to try and sort of emphasize here is largely that Trump is much more irrelevant than most people think he is. I mean, I'm already impressed by what he's done. I had thought when he got to be president, if in 4 years he successfully ordered a tuna salad sandwich from the White House mess, I was going to be impressed. And he's done more than that. But the striking thing about the trade policy is we have been here before. That all the analogies that you're hearing, and I think they're the appropriate analogies, are to the Depression, where the United States tried to protect U.S. jobs for political or other reasons. And the reason for that is that the jobs that were valued then were agricultural jobs. And they tried to protect them. They tried to erect agricultural tariffs to do that, and they didn't succeed. It is in a time of transition when jobs are disappearing that you tend to see what are really crazy actions. I mean, the idea that China wants to sell us a lot of goods at really cheap prices, and we say, no, 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 we want to pay more, is bizarre. But when it comes to saving jobs under these circumstances, you get these irrational policies. What's happening today is, just as agriculture died at that time, manufacturing is dying, and it's nobody's fault. Productivity growth is 4 to 5% a year, and global demand growth is 2% a year, and those jobs are disappearing. Now, as the automation takes place, actually it advantages U.S. manufacturing because China's advantage is cheap labor. And as you get less and less labor in the manufacturing process, the value of cheap labor goes away. And we are, in fact, and you wouldn't know it listening to Trump, we are, in fact, experiencing a manufacturing revival in the United States. It's just that there are no jobs associated with it. It is an automated revival, and nobody's going to save things. So Trump is trying to do something that people have tried to do before in a different context. And I think it's not just Trump. I think there's a lot of sympathetic reaction. But ultimately, it's hopeless. Second thing I'd like to emphasize is, and this is, again, one of the lovely benefits of Trump, is that he's going about it in a way that's almost certainly going to make no difference. Trying to stop bilateral trade when trade and sources of goods in a global environment can move from China to Vietnam to Thailand is never going to work. So as long as he keeps trying to do that, don't worry about it.
All right, well, let me get to a point Joe was starting to make about politics and workers, because what's actually going on, and this is a serious point, it's not just the United States, it's all over the world, is while trade does benefit people on average, that is, economies are better off, that doesn't mean everybody individually is better off. if you look at two big forces for workers of globalization and technological change, how do you rank those as factors that are disrupting work and jobs and the politics that go with it? Bruce?
Oh, I think it's overwhelming the technological change. I think that we are in the middle of, and you see it in Europe, you will see it in China, you've seen it in Japan for 30 years, an extraordinarily difficult transition. And it is a transition from centralized manufacturing institutions with jobs that are male-oriented to decentralized service institutions with jobs that have a much higher human relationship content that favor women. And that is in many ways an incredibly difficult transition. And I'm just going to mention 3 of them. The first is that it's easy to generate productivity growth if you're Carlos Ghosn and you've got a concentrated institution where you can put your engineers to work. If you've got decentralized service institutions, it's much harder to do that. Now, we've learned to do that in the United States, and if you look at restaurants in the United States versus Paris, we do it with a lot less people. But it's hard to do, and people have to learn to do it. The Japanese have not learned to do it, and that is really the source of the problems that they've had. So that's going to be a huge difficulty. The second problem is when you work in a decentralized way, you can identify individual productivities. So in the United States today, there are about 130,000 non-degreed extractive workers. That's all the coal miners, that's all the oil platform workers. There are 260,000 coaches and professional athletes. The coaches and professional athletes work individually, and you have an enormous spread in income distribution. The miners work together, and it's a much narrower income distribution. So as this change takes place, you're going to get a huge spread in the distribution of income, and it's going to be hard to stop. The third thing, as I say, is that workers are going to have to change the kinds of jobs they do. And what that means is that generations are going to have to adjust behaviors. Now, turns out manufacturing jobs were in every way much better than farm jobs. Service jobs are not better than manufacturing jobs. So that is also going to be, especially for men, a big, difficult transition. And it's going to take a long time.
I think our jobs are actually better than manufacturing.
Oh,
jobs.
yeah.
We are.
Can I just say,
Yeah.
I'm not sure the way you pose the question, which is more important, technological change or globalization in causing the disruption, is the right way of thinking about it. I mean, obviously, they're both present. And if you had to choose one or the other, the right answer is technological change. But I think the way to think about it is, with technological change, there would have been an enormous amount of disruption. Wages would have been, unskilled workers would have been under downward pressure. There would have been all this dislocation that Bruce talked about. If you then ask, on top of that, you add globalization, it's making all those problems even more difficult. So another way of putting it is the following. If there had been no technological change, just the presence of globalization would have imposed an enormous amount of strain. And it's not just the employment, because we talk about the United States having a more flexible labor market than Europe. Well, the corresponding to that is, yes, we can keep full employment, but wages are driven down. And that's why, if you look at, for instance, the median, people in the median wage of a full-time male worker in the United States, it's at the same level as it was 42 years ago. And that, is obviously going very much against the idea that every generation was going to be better off. So I think one has to see these as compounding effects, and we haven't done a good job in managing either of them.
Can I actually put numbers on this?
Yep.
How many people here are old enough to remember the giant sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico?
Ross Perot.
For Ross Perot. We know how big that sound was. that if you look at the 11 years before he ran for office, manufacturing demand in the United States, and it's the good jobs are the manufacturing jobs, and they're the ones that are most vulnerable to trade, that had grown by 40%. Manufacturing output had grown in the United States by 34%. That's a 6% difference that's being lost to globalization. Employment in manufacturing had fallen by 9%. The difference between 34 and 9 is technology. Going from 40 plus 40 to minus 9, 85% of the difference is technology. 15% of the difference is trade. Now, that's gotten a little worse, but it's still 2/3 or more technology, 1/3 trade.
Let me pick up on something you'd said earlier, too, about services in that context. Is there a difference when we move from agriculture to manufacturing? That's different than manufacturing to services in the mix of global versus local.
Yes,
I mean, how do you think
absolutely.
about that?
Well, I think that what you see is services are locally produced and consumed. And actually, for businesses, that's very good. The way you make money in business is either to invest a lot or to dominate a market. Big markets like poor old Carlos Ghosn is dealing with are impossible to dominate. There are no real barriers to entry. You can be viable as an automobile company with 2% global market share, and you're not going to keep anybody out. Local service markets like distributing soft drinks in competition with Coca-Cola, you have to get 25% market share to be viable. And you have to do it because people consume services on a regular basis, and you tend to have higher customer loyalty. You're not just buying a car every 7 years. You tend to, market share changes hands at 0.2% a year in that market. So you're talking about an entrant having a 125-year task. Those enormous barriers to entry create huge opportunities for profits in local service businesses that don't exist in a competitive manufacturing world. And that's why, contrary to what Thomas Friedman, who is always wrong about everything, said was going to happen to American business, profit share of American businesses in the last 25 years has gone from about 8.5% of national income to about 14% of national income. So it is going to be very good for businesses, but still bad for workers.
I want to turn to public policy toward all this. If the approach to trade isn't right in dealing with these dislocations, what would be the right policy recommendations for dealing with the problems of workers left behind? Joe?
Well, I think there are two ways to think about this. One is, I do think markets don't smoothly move people from one industry to another to create the new industries, and they don't smoothly move workers. So going back to the transition from agriculture to manufacturing, what was really pivotal in that was U.S. Was the war, basically.
Mobilization. Yeah.
It was the war that moved people from the rural to the urban. It was the GI Bill that provided a lot of people with the education that you needed for a modern manufacturing. So there were a lot of things that happened where the government played a very important role in this transition from agriculture to manufacturing. The transition from manufacturing to services, the government needs probably to play even a bigger role, and the reason I say that is several of the service areas that are particularly important, the government is intimately involved in finance. We can talk about where the best system of production, but we're talking about healthcare, education, caring for the aged, a whole set of services that have, for a good reason, I think, traditionally, the government's played a very important role. So it's important both for organizing the transition and for financing the new economy for there to be a more important role for government, but it's not been doing that. The second thing is that because I think it won't happen, this creation of the new jobs, the retraining of the labor force, is not going to happen. And some of this has to do with the sociology, that the jobs are more service-oriented jobs, more gendered jobs. It's going to be very difficult. There are going to be a lot of people that are going to be left behind. And that's where I think there are going to be programs like earned income tax credits, kinds of income support, social protection, that are going to be important so that we don't have the kind of tension that we have today.
Yeah, on that point, how should we think about programs like the earned income tax credit? It's a general wage subsidy, let's, for the sake of the audience, might be American, versus some kind of government guaranteed income. There's a movement in the tech sector, for example, for universal guaranteed income. How do you think about those two, Joe? And then
well, my view is that it is the responsibility of government to make sure that everybody who wants a job should be able to have one. And I think for most people, work is still meaningful, a meaningful part of their life. There are lots of studies that show that we may be a little bit too addicted to work, but that people who don't have work are very unhappy, and just giving the wages doesn't really solve the problem. You know, in there's some parts of the world where there, you know, in the Middle East, lots of money flowing around, lots of unemployment. The fact that they have money doesn't really solve their social problems. So to me, I've actually been suspect of the universal basic income because it keeps away pressure. It reduces the pressure to make sure there are jobs for everyone.
I always knew you, Joe, like me, were a Calvinist, and it
Well,
certainly
I mean,
is now.
I'm a Scorpion. I'm going to disagree with everybody.
Okay, here we go.
I think you have to respect local cultural differences. And this is a lecture on globalization. The U.S. is a country and a culture that particularly valorizes work. So if you go to a party and you see somebody interesting, you say, "Who's that?" And they tell you, and then you immediately say in the U.S., "Oh, what does he do for a living?" You go to a party in England and you say, "Who's that?" And they say, "Oh, that's the Duke of Devonshire." You don't say, "Oh, what does he do for a living?" It's a totally different culture. I think that in the U.S., you're going to have to do something that supports work. I think people won't accept it. I think it's the right thing to do. And I think for the U.S., there's no question about that. But Europeans have different cultures. And I don't think we should necessarily prescribe for them.
Yeah, can I just say one thing? Often my younger students will say, "You don't really appreciate our spiritual values." And they say that they can have perfectly meaningful lives without work. But
Okay, let's hope they don't have an opportunity to find out. By the way, I showed you the slides. All the students get a job, so they're fine. They're fine. Now, since we're talking about the United States in that context, we are sitting here in France. So let me change the channel to Europe in the discussions we were having. Bruce, you've been highlighting this transition to services. How is Europe doing in that regard relative to, say, the United States?
Well, I mean, you can see it. Historically, productivity growth in Europe is 1% to 2% higher than the U.S. before the war. I mean, since the war, sorry, the war being World War II. Lately, U.S. has had the highest productivity growth in the world, except for a brief period when Obama was interfering with the economy. But
and we won't give you a chance to respond. This is Bruce.
No, he has to get a chance to respond. But, you know, they are not concentrating on trying to change that. I mean, I'll give you just a simple example that strikes me in Paris. You go to a cafe in Paris, and it's not a cafeteria. It's not like Starbucks where you get your own dish. Somebody comes out and serves you.
Which do you enjoy more?
Oh, I like getting my own dishes.
Oh, well.
And I also like the efficiency of that. The second thing is you look at the numbers of these cafes, and they're not specialized. In the United States, all those Restaurants tend to be specialized, and that's a dimension of efficiency. I think it's going to be very difficult for them in Europe, and I think they're also unusually attached to manufacturing jobs. I mean, I think Trump is crazy when he talks about saving manufacturing jobs, but all over Europe, they're absolutely dedicated to it. And I don't see any sort of concerted effort to generate efficient services. And I think what Joe talked about, education and healthcare, are relatively underdeveloped, especially education. And I don't see a big change in that direction. I think Europe is going to be in trouble for a very long time.
So first, I think actually, if you look at the productivity numbers, say in France, they're actually very strong. And if you take into account real problems of measurement, that, for instance, we spend about 18% now of GDP on healthcare, and our health outcomes are much worse than France. And so that makes it look like France has a lower GDP per capita than we do, but that's just money that's going into rents and into inefficiency in the U.S. healthcare. And anybody who experiences French healthcare really will say, except for that very, very top elite in the United States, that U.S. Is not doing as well as France. In fact, U.S. is one of the few countries where there has been a decline in life expectancy. And it's not because of healthcare. It's not because we don't know. We're doing great research at Columbia and other universities. It's because our health delivery system is not working. But the real problem with Europe, I think, is the euro. And that the euro, the single currency, has been a chain around the neck. It really means that it is very difficult for Europe to respond to the various kinds of shocks that it's experienced beginning back in 2008 and going forward. And it's very difficult to predict where the next shock. Right now, Italy is a major problem. But the fundamental issue is that when you have a single currency, countries that need to expand, in the past, Italy would have lowered its exchange rate, lowered its interest rate, stimulated the economy, and that would have enabled it to grow relative to other countries. And now it can't do that. And it doesn't have the control of interest rate, doesn't have control of exchange rate. It's constrained by the European rules on even having deficits. And so that, I think, has been a real constraint on the ability of Europe to get back to full employment and really robust growth.
And just to expand a little bit on what Joe's saying, is I wanted to ask something about it. When you have a common currency like the euro, if you need to make an adjustment in a country and you can't have independent monetary policy, then you'd have basically your real exchange would have to adjust, but that's really just an expression saying real wages need to fall in the country, which is why you're seeing a lot of dislocations. Expand on that a bit, Joe. If you look around the euro area, is there a link between populism we're seeing and some of this difference in adjustment across regions?
Well, I think clearly there is some link between them. I don't want to put it. It's not just economics. I mean, obviously.
I was going to ask you about immigration too, but we'll talk about economics first. Okay.
So you look at the problem of Italy. Italy's basically had its economy roughly stagnating since the euro was created, and it hasn't been able to adjust the exchange rate. There is another way besides lowering wages, which is to have the strong countries in Europe increase their wages and prices. So that would mean that Germany would have slightly higher inflation, Until recently, they didn't even have a minimum wage. But the framework within Europe has put all the burden on the weaker countries to lower their wages. And that's very difficult in most countries. It's very hard to tell workers, take a 20% wage cut. There are some countries like Ireland and Greece that accepted that, but it's really hard. And Italy is not willing to accept that. And that's when you start getting the kind of political backlash to say, look, within the confines of Europe, we haven't been able to do anything.
So are you saying...
Well, let me just say, Germany is not happy. Let's be clear about that. They are feeding off the rest of Europe to sustain a manufacturing sector, and they're doing it successfully. But they are not happy at all either. It seems to me it is not the euro that's causing the trouble. I mean, I gave a speech in Germany about sort of this topic. I followed a guy...
It was on happiness and well-being.
On this. I followed a famous German who was talking, and he said, you know, if we Germans don't get into the streets and start complaining about other people taking our money, the Greeks and so on, we're going to be finished. So I decided to lighten the mood, and I said, I don't know anything about how you're being taken advantage of by the Greeks, but it seems to me that the last time Germans went into the streets and protested like that, it didn't work out so well. Nobody laughed.
I'm wondering why.
They are very seriously unhappy, and you see
but
the
let
same
me connect what
populace-
both of you said, if I might, because when Joe was rightly saying there are other ways to plug this gap, another one is fiscal transfers. So to the point you just made and the point Joe had teed up, are you saying, Joe, for example, get rid of the euro, or are you saying surplus countries could make some fiscal transfers? What do you say?
So, I mean, I think a lot of this is our perception. So in the case in Germany, there's very strong sense that they do not want to be engaged in transfers. In fact, there's an expression they have, Europe is not a transfer union. And that says, you know, they didn't get together to help the poor countries. But the real point is that Germany's been benefiting from the lower exchange rate. That is really what has allowed it to become the export, to do as successful in exports as they have been. They have somehow gotten the view that they are subsidizing Greece. And this is a very deep-seated feeling. Now, part of the reason for that was that there were what were called bailouts of Greece, but the bailouts of Greece were really bailouts of German and French banks. Greece owed money to German and French banks. And if Greece went into default, there would be a problem in German and French banks. So what happened was Germany lent the Troika, IMF, the European Central Bank, and lent money to Greece to give money back to Germany. And what has happened over the succeeding several years is that that money keeps getting rolled over. The banks now got out of their debt, and the European Central Bank took over the Greek debt. And so now what they did is basically socialize that private debt and made it a national obligation. But there is a strong perception that even though, you know, that Greece has been vastly subsidized. And as I say, Greece has gotten about, of all the money that's gone, only about 10% has actually gone to Greece. 90% actually went back to the rest of Europe.
I want to change the channel to something else, but I do want to point out something that ties together both of these discussions that we had about trade and Europe, and it's the gainers from a multilateral arrangement. When they forget to compensate losers, there may be issues. I want to switch gears to the Fed, and we now have a colleague.
The loco.
Loco, according to our president, about the Fed. We now have a colleague, Rich Clarida, a good personal friend of mine, who's now the vice chair of the Fed. We have a new Fed chairman. Should the Fed be caring about the impact of U.S. monetary policy on emerging markets or things outside the United States? Bruce?
Well, the answer is probably yes. But the thing about the Fed is, and I hope people are reassured by this, that we have been through a period of extraordinary monetary policy, extraordinary low interest rates, extraordinary amounts of printing money, and it has made almost zero difference in the real economy. And I think that's because there have been structural reforms in the banking system in the United States, but also other places, where it has eviscerated the power of the Fed within these countries. And I think, therefore, we don't have to worry about the raising of interest rates because for the United States, lowering them didn't make any difference. So I think that in domestic terms, it's not something that realistically is going to have a big impact. On the other hand, there are lots of developing countries out there with dollar-denominated debt, and they're going to get murdered.
Yeah, so I just came back from the IMF meetings in Bali.
Yep.
And it is the subject of everybody's discussion. Sure. And what's at issue here is that as the Fed starts raising interest rates, a lot of the money that was created, a lot of the liquidity that was created since 2008 in QE and went to emerging markets and developing countries. And as the interest rates start to increase, and even more because the U.S. now has a huge fiscal deficit and will be borrowing money, the flow of money is going to be going out of these countries. And there are going to be many countries that will be going into crisis. The countries with large current account deficits, large amounts of dollar-denominated debt, those countries where when the money went in, it helped create bubbles. So there are lots of countries which fall into that kind of category. And it was predictable that Argentina would have a crisis. It was predictable.
It's always predictable that Argentina will have a crisis. That's another story.
And Turkey.
Yeah.
It was predictable that Turkey. And a little bit less predictable until you understood what was going on. But it's affecting Indonesia, South Africa. Basically, all the emerging markets now are really in a very nervous state.
But should the Fed care, or is it the fault of some of the countries? What are you saying?
Well, the first point is, no matter how good these countries' policies are, the countries that are at the forefront of the problems are countries that typically have not had the best of policies. But a lot of the countries that are being affected today, like Indonesia, we're actually doing things reasonably well. Malaysia, reasonably well. And I don't want to say perfect, but it is affecting every country. And so there's no... now, the question is, should the U.S. care? I think it should, because in some ways, what happens here, what happens there will come back and affect the United States. We live in a globalized economy.
Yeah, and I think you can actually see that. This has happened before, and it happened with Asian economies in 1997 and 98. Before that, Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia actually ran deficits that helped relieve the surpluses that China and Japan and Germany were running. In the wake of the collapse of their currencies, because they had big dollar-denominated debts that caused widespread bankruptcies within those countries, they let their currencies fall by a factor of 2. They're never going to run deficits again. And the problem with the world is you add up the deficits and the surpluses, and they have to come to zero. So that the fact that Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia went from deficit to significant surplus put a great deal of additional stress on the international system. And in these less developed countries, and the ones that are in trouble, Joe, are the ones that have borrowed in dollars. I mean, if their currencies just fall, that will help their exports and will help their competitiveness. But right now, they are the deficit countries. And if they decide to go to surplus, guess who's going to eat all the surpluses? Donald Trump's America. And that's not going to be good for at least his view of the world.
So that's praise for the tax cut? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I love
okay,
tax
okay.
cuts.
All right, great. So before I turn, this is a clue that you should be getting ready with questions. I want to ask you guys a final question. You teach together this incredibly popular class in globalization. What's the biggest lesson you want a student or an alum, if they were hearing it, to take away for a business career? Either one of you first.
Oh, well, I'll tell you what I teach them, which is that globalization is an important force, but just like that calculation I did for the giant sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico, most of the real action, especially in a service economy, is local. And in a global world, to succeed, you have to adapt locally global technology. So it is well-functioning local economies that matter. China didn't do well because of developments outside China. China did well because China changed. So don't get distracted by globalization.
Okay,
So-
don't be distracted.
And I guess the thing I try to stress is that as we become more globalized, we become more interdependent, and what happens in one country has effects on others, like the example
Right.
we're talking about in monetary policy. And that's true in trade policy and in every other area. And I guess the bottom line out of that is the importance of multilateralism, that you need to have cooperation. If this complex system is going to work well for everybody, there have to be rules and regulations, and there have to be, there are going to be winners and losers, but if we run it right, we can make sure that there are relatively few losers, but we have to think about, both within our countries and across countries, how do we minimize that number of losers?
Okay, great. So we've gone from loco to locals. Now we're going to you. Maybe we can get the lights up, and if there are questions, I'll have to get the lights up to be able to see hands. Sir, Dick, right there. There's a microphone coming.
Hi, Richard Bott from the class of 72. What do you guys think about this notion, which Trump doesn't exactly articulate well, but the notion that the relationship between the U.S. and Europe is built on this sort of post-war model where we provided all the defense and we had all the resources and all the money, and that we've kind of passed that stage now, and Europe really does need to pay their share of the defense, and we need to get rid of some of these tariffs that are kind of long past their sell date?
Well, my view, this number that every country is supposed to spend of 2% of GDP is pulled out of the air. There's no basis of that. I've written a book, maybe I call it the $3 trillion war, where I took the view that we were spending lots of money on weapons that didn't work against enemies that didn't exist. And we're lucky that there aren't those enemies. But after the end of the Cold War, we had an opportunity to restructure our defense network, our defense expenditures. That what we've done, though, is to continue with all those things that were aimed at the world before the end of the Cold War. And now we have additional problems of terrorism and cybersecurity. But what we really should have done is reoriented how much we were spending. And I really think that the problem is not that they may be spending a little bit too little. I think the real problem is that we're spending too much. But on the overall issue that he's also said about Europe is cheating America in trade policy, the numbers, I don't know if you've seen the kind of numbers, like the average tariff of Europe against the United States is 3.1 or 2, and of U.S. against Europe is 2.9. The differences between the two are minuscule, and have nothing to do with the patterns of trade. So the idea that they are cheating us in trade policy just doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, I have a slightly different view. I think the first is the good news. Dick, when you and Joe and I were young, 9% of US GDP went to defense. Today, that number, I think, is below 3%. So we've had a huge peace dividend. I think that the need for defense has clearly declined dramatically. I mean, there's one big defense issue where I think you want to worry, but it's not an issue of expenditure, which is nuclear proliferation. And I think that there are real issues of who's pulling their weight to try and stop that and who's not. But I think that the idea that everybody has to contribute in this area similarly is an idea that, if you believe Joe that there's going to be effective international cooperation, probably has an important role to play. If, like me, you think international cooperation is a joke and a dream, then it's just a distraction.
I think you can see why they play off one another in teaching. Got time for more questions, sir? I'll come back to I'm sorry, the mic was already over here.
I've been kind of surprised at how calm inflation has been. When I look at the president's policies in America, they seem very inflationary. I grew up, I got my MBA in '67 at Columbia. I learned about the law of comparative advantage. We seem to be disregarding that. I look at the price of energy year over year. I look at labor, employment, unemployment under 4%, which seemed to me we're setting up for a big surprise in inflation. I'm curious if you two minds up there, three minds, have a view on the CPI next year.
Well, okay, first thing is you cannot look at the CPI. It's a very bad measure of inflation. So if you look at the GDP deflators, which only come out 4 times a year, not every month, there's actually a very dramatic story. And it's not only that inflation is low, it's that it's been incredibly stable. Even at the depth of the crisis, when there was very high unemployment, inflation got down to 0.9%. It's been... it has stayed between 0.9 and 1.8 for years now. I think it's because as you move to a service economy with locally dominant service companies, they take advantage slowly of pricing power. They have pricing power. They take advantage of it slowly so that they don't scare the chickens. And that means you get very stable price changes. I think it's just a different economy, Lee.
Yeah, I think the other reason that there's no inflationary pressure right now is that the labor market is still very weak. I mean, one way of thinking about it is the shock of 2008 led to an enormous number of people who lost their jobs, but also who were afraid of losing their jobs. And actually, globalization enters into this, that people know that they're in a competitive market, and that if they raise their wages, they may not be able to export as much or compete with imports. So I think that there are a number of factors that have made it very difficult for workers to get wage increases, and that's also led to a tempering of price increases.
I would agree with this all, Lee, but I guess what I would add is, 6 months ago, I went to a meeting with Fed officials where they were worried they wanted to lower the inflation target, and I said, you got to be kidding me. In 6 months, we'll be at 2% PCE. We're roughly there now, and wages are rising relatively smartly, so I think inflationary expectations are contained, but the idea that we'll never get inflation up into 2% plus, that one I would get off that train. But sir, I had called on you before, so I'll give you the shot.
Nicholas Frank-Pound, class of '09. Sorry to bring you back to Europe, but in view of the fact that its exchange rate flexibility is impossible, in view of the fact in the Eurozone, in view of the fact that transfers look politically unpalatable, and in view of the fact that the continuance of the Eurozone is pretty much assured, how long do you think this can go on for?
Well, Joe and I at the forum like this 6 years ago, I think both thought that 5 years from then the euro would be dead. The Europeans, especially the Southern Europeans, have shown an extraordinary tolerance for pain. Maybe it's the Catholic Church, who knows?
Yeah.
But I don't know that that's going to change. Now, they are unhappy, but they're just as unhappy in Germany as they are other places. And I think that's because of the overall slowdown. I mean, Europe collects between 50 and 60% of everybody's income. And that works fine if you've got the kinds of growth rates you saw in the wake of the Second World War. I think not having them, you're going to get that discontent growing. And as Joe and I agree, the euro has made it worse, but people don't seem to be willing to drop out of the euro. So, hey, in some fundamentally bizarre and perverse sense, maybe you guys are enjoying all this.
So,
Okay, Joe, do you have some?
I think there's going to be a continuing tension. I think there is increasing realization that the strictures of the Eurozone are a major contributor to problems, say, in Italy. I think in the case of Greece, they understood that, but they weren't willing to leave the euro. And there was a recognition that leaving the euro would be traumatic, but staying in the euro has also been traumatic, and they're still in a depression. And without end. I mean, I think that, and what was celebrated in the case of Greece as, the exit was an agreement to keep what is called a primary surplus of 3.5% for the next 40 years. No country has been able to do anything like that for more than 5 years. So the kinds of demands that are being put are politically unreasonable. I don't think Italy is as likely to be able to accept that kind of torture, and the politics will take its course, and I think it is going to be unpredictable. And I think the worry is going to be that there will be at some moment a really critical event. And let me make one more comment, which is, if markets anticipate that there might be a referendum or an election, then that would lead to a decision to leave the euro. There could be an attack on the currency that would be hard for the European Central Bank to deal with. Draghi said he would do whatever it takes, but that's not been put to the test. And so it could be put to the test in a way where it would fail. And so it would not be anybody's decision. It would just be like other crises. The markets really drive what is going to happen in the context of a political events going on.
Okay, so we have the markets versus La Dolce Vita. Sorry.
Kasana 1516. There's a serious interest in the healthcare that we have in the U.S. By patients and physicians from all over the world. And also, there is an interest in the US in getting patients from all over the world. And the question is, this is a service as well. Is there any specific particularity about healthcare compared to other services from the perspective of globalization?
Well, it's very local. I mean, it's hard to go for a doctor's visit to Paris, although I'd love to do it. I mean, it's just not convenient. So that level of health care is always going to be local. And I think the problem with critical health care is that, shipping people who are deathly sick to efficient markets to deal with them is, again, not going to be practical. So I think what you're left with on health care are sort of the elective procedures. And there, it's still going to be rich people who do it. And they're going to be quality interested. So I think the U.S. just as it does in education, is going to have a huge surplus in that area.
So we'll dominate Botox tourism, is that what you're
Yeah.
saying? Sir.
Ralph McCarr, class of 1990. Some experts have indicated that we're currently in the third wave of the Industrial Revolution with the maker movement, basically the use of 3D printers, micro-manufacturing, anything under 10,000 units. Can you comment on how that's going to impact globalization? Because everyone wants everything customized, and that technology is getting down into much, much lower costs and affordability and availability for everyone.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, I happen to think that globalization is going to die. And it's going to die for exactly the reason that you described. Manufacturing scale, as you get those efficiencies, is going to be smaller. That productivity growth is going to be large in manufacturing, but not in transportation to the same extent because it's already essentially completely automated, which means that all the manufacturing is going to come back onshore, and it's going to be local. Now, there is a terrible problem associated with that, which we haven't talked about, but maybe we were going to get into, which is the successful development model is export-led growth. And it's manufacturing-led growth because, as we've talked about, when you have big manufacturing institutions, you concentrate resources and you have big economies of scale in developing skills. If you don't go through that, it's very hard to develop those skills and that way of doing business on a decentralized basis, which means that people who do not get on this train, and we're talking mostly about Africa, in the next 20 years are probably never going to get on this train. And that's a huge problem.
Yeah, well, Bruce is right about that. I'm actually, there are some strategies that the African and other countries, it's too late in some sense. They can't do what East Asia did in 1980s and 1990s. They missed that moment. And so they're going to have to think about a multi-pronged strategy, which will entail, for instance, higher tech agriculture. The United States had enormous increase productivity in agriculture beginning in the middle of the 19th century, but it was agriculture extension services provided by the government that really provided the basis of productivity. And so they'll have to think of...
I always thought it was the mechanical reaper, but that's
No,
another story.
it is the Agricultural Extension Service.
Yeah.
Joe is right. It was an extraordinary institution, and it existed no place else in the world, and that's why we are the dominant agricultural power still today. Go ahead, sorry.
But the point is, there'll be similar things in agriculture, in the services. Bruce talked about services. The unit is too small to do the kind of research that goes on in a chemical or manufacturing industry. But there still are productivity advances, and the question is, how do you promote those and how do you disseminate the ideas? So there'll have to be other ways of promoting innovation, promoting dissemination of ideas. And from the point of view of the developing countries and emerging markets, they're going to have to look at how to do what manufacturing did, but across not just manufacturing, but services and agriculture.
Got a question over here, the microphone? Yeah.
Hi, Miriam Cordero from 2011. I would like to get your thoughts on Brexit.
Brexit.
All right, I'm going to do this really quickly. I think people are very unhappy with European bureaucracies. If they persist in going after it one by one, which was Grexit by themselves, Brexit by themselves, and I don't know what italic exit is going to sound like, but pretty ugly, it's going to work out badly. I think what you've got to think about is collective action. Now, in terms of Brexit, as long as the British don't try and rely on their own labor force, and they continue to import talented people like the people in this room, they'll probably
And British
be
people
just
in this room are also talented.
talented, yes. They will probably be fine. Go ahead.
Well, I think almost sure if I had to predict what's going to happen, is there will likely be what is called a soft Brexit, which is that they will keep in a common market. One of the things that was not talked about in the referendum is the difficulty of the Irish question. That is to say that they don't have a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and they can't have a border between Ireland and Great Britain. And there is really no solution to this other than having them within the common market. Politically, the strong Brexiteers like Boris Johnson find that unacceptable. I think some people were hoping that they found it so unacceptable that when May presents that to the British Parliament, they'll vote against it. But if they do, it'll bring down the government, there'll be a general election, and the fact is the people who are taking that position will probably not do that well. And so they probably won't take that risk. And so I think the bet is, my bet would be, that they will go forward with that common market where things will have, with no definite, they'll continue the negotiations forever. And so it will, for those who wanted a Brexit, it will be a Brexit. They will no longer be in the European Union, so they'll get that symbolic victory. But in terms of reality, the UK will have given up its vote in the EU, and everything else will go on pretty much unchanged.
Okay, we've got time for another.
Oh, there's one more thing.
Yeah.
The issue of migration is, so they talk about this. It'll be sort of like what they call the Norway solution for everything except migration, and there's something called the Liechtenstein solution for the migration, which basically says that they'll be allowed to impose restraints on migration, but at a level that is non-binding, so that they'll have won the right to have limits, but not actually at a level which would make any difference.
Now I know what diplomats do. Okay, so yes.
Hillary Cecil Jordan, 1980. How meaningful is the trend towards isolationism in Europe and the US? And if it is meaningful, what is its effect on globalization?
Gentlemen?
Well, I think I would put a whole set of things like isolationism, nativism, turning inward. And I think that these are reactions to perceived failures of our society to deal with a whole host of problems. That large fractions, of America have not been doing very well. There's problems of deindustrialization that we've been talking about. And it's very easy to say the problem is somebody else. The migrants that are coming in, the problem is trade. And if we only didn't have these problems from outside and we just, the problems wouldn't be there. It's total nonsense. I mean, take even the issue of migration. You probably know that by the time, since 2008, we've had almost no migration from Mexico. And so the real issue, the wall would keep Mexicans from going back to Mexico. So, it's not going to solve any problem. So it is a failure of our policy to have addressed some real grievances that I think are real, but this is not the solution.
Yeah, I think, again, isolationism is not at all the heart of the problem. As Joe says, it's lovely to blame everybody else and say, if only we cut ourselves off from the world, it would be better. But I hope it's clear from this discussion that that's not going to work. So that in the long run, I think isolationism has got to go away.
Got time for one more question over here.
Yes, my name is Robert Yu. I'm class of 03 and I'm from South Korea. I actually wanted to ask you a question related to North Korea's globalization. Currently, now it's
not
funny,
terribly large, but
hypothetically, because of current trends and and issues, South Korean government officials and business people are talking about setting up businesses in North Korea, and it seems that there is a possibility that one of these days North Korea will open their doors. As economists and historians, set aside politics. I mean, if you had to advise North Korea in becoming global, playing a global role, do you have any advice?
Well, the president already said beachfront property. I think that was his advice for North Korea, but I'll let our panel weigh in.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think the major issue with North Korea is the issue of nuclear proliferation. And the question is, will bringing North Korea more into the fold of South Korea, more normalizing North Korea, is that more likely to reduce the issue of the dangers of nuclear, or increase it? And my own view is that it will reduce it, that the effort should be to try to normalize North Korea, and that have it less isolated. We've tried the other for a very long time. It didn't work very well. And so I think the policy of the current government to try to begin breaking down some of the barriers is the right one.
I think it's also going to have to be a slow process. I don't think the North Koreans want to be enthralled to the South Koreans. I don't think they want to all work for South Korean businessmen. I don't think they all want to sort of be governed by South Korean bureaucrats. And inevitably, that's the direction in which things are going to go if you look at what happened in Germany after the reunification. So I think that it's going to have to be, it's a very beneficial process, but I think it's going to have to be done very carefully.
I would remind you, though, Mrs. Merkel is from East Germany. So
I know
with
that,
that,
but she got converted.
Okay. I think you can get a sense of what is so special, both at the school in general and talking about globalization and technological change, but in the class that these two guys teach. They are unique scholars, unique teachers, great parts of our community. Join me in thanking Bruce Greenwald and Joe Stiglitz. And instead of the transition from agriculture to manufacturing and manufacturing services, you're going to make a transition to coffee and then come back.